Morning. Welcome to Stockholm. I hope you all had a chance to grab some coffee on your way in. On behalf of the impressive group of panelists before you and the United States Institute of Peace, it is my pleasure to welcome you to World Water Week. My name is Cassandra Schneider, and I lead the United States Institute of Peace's portfolio on conflicts related to water. The United States Institute of Peace is a congressionally founded, nonpartisan, and independent institute dedicated to the prevention, mitigation, and resolution of violent conflict. USIP's climate, environment, and conflict practice is committed to working with experts and communities around the world to better understand how climate change impacts conflict dynamics as they relate to critical resources, including water and the transition to the global green economy. Understanding pathways to peace around shared waters is important to USIP because it guides our work with communities dealing with these issues around the world. We have had the honor of working with and funding the research of many of the session's panelists, and I encourage you to visit our website to learn more, as we have several new research papers we will be publishing in the coming weeks. Over the course of the next hour and a half, we will build on UN 2023 Water Conference commitments to identify actionable targets for systems-level change for inclusive and sustainable transboundary water cooperation and governance. Several of our panelists will give a brief overview of their research before we dive into the panel discussion, moderated by Dr. Melissa McCracken. Dr. McCracken is an assistant professor of international environmental policy at Tufts University, where she directs the Shared Waters Lab, co-directs the Center for International Environment and Resource Policy, and is an affiliate of the Center of International Law and Governance. After she sets the scene, Alexandra Turgel from the Oregon State University, Dr. Susanna Schmeier from IHE Delft, and Dr. Caroline Pelleton from the Geneva Water Hub will each give a lightning talk on what factors contribute to sustainable transboundary water cooperation or shape conflict dynamics. Alexandra Turgel is a PhD candidate in geography at Oregon State University, working with Dr. Erin Wolf. She is the manager of the Transboundary Freshwater Diplomacy Database. Her research takes a multiscalar approach to the study of power and politics in transboundary river basins and water conflict transformation. Dr. Susanna Schmeier is the head of the Water Governance Department and an associate professor of water law and diplomacy at IHE Delft. She focuses on the legal and institutional dimensions of water resource governance at both the subnational and the transboundary levels, the role of agreements and basin organizations, negotiation and conflict resolution processes and tools, as well as the sustainable management of ecosystems linked to water resources. Dr. Caroline Pelleton is the operations director for the Geneva Water Hub, overseeing the implementation of the Hub's programs. She also oversees the program on the protection of water in armed conflicts. Prior to working at the Hub, she served as a coordinator for the Water and Habitat Unit of the International Committee of the Red Cross. The lightning talks will lay the groundwork for a moderated discussion in which panelists will provide insights from their practice and experience. In addition to our lightning talk speakers, I am pleased to welcome and introduce Ambassador Tanja Miškova from the government of Slovenia, Anders Jägerskog from the World Bank, Astrid Hillers from the Global Environment Facility, and Norris Nwana from the government of Zimbabwe. Ambassador Miškova is in charge of water diplomacy and the circular economy at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Slovenia. During her diplomatic career, she served as Director General for Multilateral Affairs and Development Cooperation, as Head of Department for Emerging Challenges, Ambassador of Egypt, and as Diplomatic Advisor to the President of Slovenia. Dr. Jägerskog leads the water global practice at the World Bank, where he focuses on the Middle East and North Africa. He previously served as the Counselor for Regional Water Resources in the MENA region in the Swedish Embassy in Amman, Jordan, and as the Director of Knowledge Services at the Stockholm International Water Institute, where he headed the Transboundary Water Management Unit. Astrid Hillers is a Senior Environmental Specialist at the Global Environment Facility. She is responsible for the Global Environment Facility's work on international waters in Africa and on shared waters and groundwater in Asia. She also leads several cross-sectoral strategic initiatives at the GEF, including on water security and the nexus between water, food, energy, and ecosystems. Norris Anwana is the legal advisor for the Ministry of Lands, Agriculture, Fisheries, Water, and Rural Development of the Government of Zimbabwe. Mr. Anwana's background in the environmental law and a focus on international water law has enabled his participation in the negotiations and development of several water agreements, including the Safe Watercourse Agreement and the Bait Bridge Musina Water Supply Agreement, among others. He is Zimbabwe's national focal point on the Water Convention, where he is leading a team working on the accession to the Global Water Conventions. This is an interactive session. You will be asked to participate through a Mentimeter poll, which you can access through the QR code on the slide. In addition, we will open the floor to the audience for questions after the panel discussion and ask that you hold any questions for both the speakers and panelists until then. The findings from our session will be documented and shared widely in a joint publication. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. McCracken up to set the scene. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy what promises to be an engaging and interesting session together.
All right, thank you, Casey. So I want to get us started. I know most of you in this room are quite familiar with many of these maps, but I think it's a good place to start where we are with respect to transboundary waters. So when we're talking about transboundary waters and as a pathway to peace and looking at drivers of conflict and cooperation, we want to think about where are these actually located globally. So we have 313 transboundary river basins across the globe. So you can see them laid out here. They contribute about 60% of the world's catchment flow and about 50%, excluding Antarctica, of the world's land surface. But it's not just surface waters, as we tend to kind of dominate in the discourse, but there's also our transboundary aquifers, where we have around 600 transboundary aquifers and groundwater bodies, and are just going to become increasingly more important moving forward. The lack of institutions such as treaties on transboundary groundwaters are going to become really vital moving forward and trying to build those cooperative processes on our transboundary groundwaters. And an emerging area that we haven't really focused much on within the discourse is transboundary wetlands. So we have some emerging research by one of our amazing PhD students, Zoe Rosenblum, at Oregon State University, and she's been mapping the locations of where these transboundary wetlands are located. And so you can see a map here of where they're located within transboundary river basins, of which she's documented over 300 so far. So in terms of setting the scene and the context for today, we all are very familiar with the fact that there's a ton of different stressors pressing on our transboundary resources and in our water resources more broadly. Climate change, economic development, infrastructure, either degradation due to aging infrastructure and lack of maintenance, or even development of new infrastructure, such as the construction of large dams, particularly in the global south, with the increase in demand for renewable energy with climate change. Political systems, governance systems, all of these have been shifting, and there's so many other stressors. And so we can see just looking at the map, so this is a recent study by Sophie de Bruyn and colleagues looking at different climate scenarios and trying to map the transboundary conflict risk. So we know that conflict is going to be potentially increasing, or at least the potential for conflict might be increasing. And the reason why we're wanting to really have this conversation with you all today is the fact that there's so much uncertainty around all of these issues. These stressors are changing. Climate change adds a very high degree of uncertainty. And so how do we actually adapt our cooperative systems to prevent conflict and to create sustainable and equitable sharing of our transboundary resources? So that's what we're going to do today. So I hope you all brought your thinking caps, because we're going to solve all of our problems right here in this session. I'm just kidding. But what I do want to note is that water we can really see as a powerful tool for peace building. But all of these factors that we've talked about really complicate relations between states. So how will transboundary basins be resilient to these different types of changes within our ecosystems, either political, environmental, or social? And will they be able to deal with all these different stressors that are coming into play? Are we going to be able to minimize negative impacts to humans, to the environment? Or will we be able to prevent conflict from occurring and create an equitable and sustainable use of our resources? So this session really aims to look at, so how do we identify the factors that are relevant for sustainable and effective cooperation or equitable cooperation and reduce this potential for conflict? And how do we understand this in the context of the future change that's going to happen? Do we need to adjust our governance structures, our cooperative processes, and all of those types of factors to deal with this high level of uncertainty that's coming forward? So what we'll be doing for the rest of the session, we'll have 3 different lightning talks, as Casey mentioned earlier, and we'll have a panel with our practitioners. So we're trying to bridge science and policy in terms of this conversation, this context that I've set up. Then we'll be asking you all to participate and ask questions of our speakers and panelists, and then we'll do some concluding remarks. So I'm going to go back to the previous slide really quick. And right now we're going to get your input first. So first, impressions on these topics before we actually dive in to hear from our panelists and speakers. So if you wouldn't mind to please join the Mentimeter poll using the QR code on the slide. We'll give you a couple seconds and then we'll transition to the Mentimeter presentation. I think we can go ahead and transition to the Mentimeter. There will be a QR code as we switch in case you haven't joined quite yet. Okay, there's no QR code, but you can use the code up top and go to menti.com and then type that code in to join the session on your phones or on your laptops. So we want to know, where do you work? What water bodies do you work on? You can list multiple answers. So go ahead and type that in and we'll get a word cloud showing, just kind of get a sense of the room of what water bodies people are working on. Because we all know water is very different in different places. So it'll be really interesting to see if there's change in people's perspectives on what's effective or what's sustainable, depending on what particular bodies of water they're working in. Or has anybody entered anything? Is there a setting maybe to show? Do you want to check, Zoe? Seems like it's working. I'm sure more than 3 of you have responded by the number of people I've seen typing, and it's probably a bit slow in loading, so. Well, I'm going to propose we move forward to the next poll because these will be a little bit more engaging than watching words come up very, very slowly on the screen. So if we could move to the next one, and you should see the poll switch on your phone to the new question. So we want to know your perspective. Are you an academic? Do you focus on research? Or are you more of a practitioner and a policymaker in the basins that you work on? Or do you fit into a different broad category? How might this change your perception of what equitable or effective and sustainable cooperation might look like, and your perception of what factors that drive conflict? Cool. This one seems to be working a little bit better. So we have a lot of practitioners and policymakers in the room, which is fantastic. All right. So let's move on to the meatier questions. If we can switch to the next slide, please. So how optimistic are you with respect to the future for transboundary waters? Do you think the future is going to trend more conflict or more cooperation? What's your gut reaction? A lot of people in the middle. So it seems like a lot of people unsure, a little bit more for conflict, but it's pretty even. Still a lot in the middle. So, I mean, I think this is probably reflective of my own personal opinion as well. Like, I think broadly, we have the capacity to do well and to make good choices for effective cooperation moving forward in the future. But there might be some I'm more concerned about versus others. So I think this is a pretty broad reflection. So if we go to the next and the last one for this portion. So what do you think is equitable or sustainable cooperation? What's the first terms that come to mind when you think of what an equitable and sustainable or effective cooperative process looks like for transboundary waters or subnational transboundary waters too? So sustainable cooperation is conflicts, preventing conflicts maybe, benefit sharing, water law, partnership, peace, sustainability, fairness. A lot of partnerships coming up. Transparency, dealing with externalities. Some great responses. And hopefully we'll see some of these themes coming up in our presentations. And then I'll ask you to kind of reflect back on what you put on this particular slide later on when we get to the end of the session and see if your thinking has shifted or evolved in any way. Give it another couple seconds for people to add any more responses. A robust legal framework, that's a new one. Regional integration. Great. All right, well, with that, we'll shift over to our first lightning talk. So I'll have Alexandra Turgle please come up, and she will be talking about, well, she's going to be talking about some overarching conflict and cooperation research findings.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you, Melissa, for setting the stage. So as Melissa said, I'll be doing more of setting the stage for our discussion today and talking about some general trends in transboundary water conflict and cooperation. So I'm sure we are all familiar with the water wars thesis, this idea that the wars of the 21st century would be over water, not oil. And even today, if you do a quick Google search of water wars, you'll see all these snappy media headlines coming up about how water wars are brewing, of how the wars of the future will be fought over water, not oil. And even today, still, it's very prevalent in some policymaking circles that this idea that interstate conflict will be erupting over transboundary waters. However, I am sure we are also familiar with this graph on the right here, which I apologize for being cut off. This graph is showing that actually the water wars thesis is really probably not going to happen because states are more likely to cooperate over their shared water resources. And so I just want to highlight that I'm talking about interstate water conflict and cooperation, not water conflict or cooperation happening at the subnational level. But when we look at the international level, countries are more likely to cooperate over their shared water resources. And this research was pioneered by Aaron Wolf and other colleagues at Oregon State University. Their main findings were that 1, there has not been an interstate water war. 2, that there is more cooperation over water than conflict, as you saw on the graph, especially at low low intensities of cooperation. And that states are unlikely to go to war over water when water is the primary source of contention. And that's, of course, not to say that water cannot act as a catalyst for conflict or that it cannot be a contributing factor, because it certainly can be. And importantly, the likelihood and intensity of dispute rises as the rate of change within a basin exceeds its institutional capacity. So basically, this highlights the role of institutions in mitigating and preventing water conflicts. and basins that do not have institutions in place, robust institutions, like treaties, river basin organizations, or other ways of formalized cooperation may be more likely to experience conflict, again, at the interstate level. Just to point out some more general trends in conflict, in conflict and cooperation. I've been saying that water cooperation is more common, but we are seeing, as evidenced by this graph here, which was published by researchers not affiliated with Oregon State University, but as you can see on their graph, there are conflict is becoming more frequent, especially at lower intensity levels. A history of conflict or cooperation between countries has implications for whether or not there will be future conflict or cooperation between shared waters. And also, it's important to remember that higher water scarcity can contribute to both increased conflict or cooperation in transboundary basins at the interstate level, depending on the context. So just because there's water scarcity, that doesn't mean that there's necessarily going to be a lot of water conflict. It could incentivize countries to cooperate more. Some things that we need to think about when thinking about what are drivers of conflict or cooperation between countries that share water resources include the effects of institutionalized cooperation and how well it's being implemented and how robust it is, which one of our lightning talks will talk about next. The climatic or hydrological variability of the basin and how well institutions in the basin can respond to this change. Broader political stability, both within a state and between states. And as Melissa was saying, the presence of large infrastructure or hydrological development. We often see an association between conflicts and the unilateral development of large infrastructure. So to help track trends in water conflict and cooperation, we have the Transboundary Freshwater Diplomacy Database, which is housed at Oregon State University. It's a geographic information system of the world's shared freshwater river basins and basically tracks how countries are cooperating over them, tracks governance. We have a treaties data set, we have a river basin organizations data set, we have a data set on water related events and how conflict or cooperation is happening over these shared river basins. And we also have a spatial database. But the purpose of my talk is not to talk more about the database. We'll be having another session about that later this week. I just want to mention that it is out there. And I am going to briefly be talking about some general trends in water conflict and cooperation we've been seeing through the research conducted at the database and by others. So about a third of transboundary river basins do not have an agreement in place. So these basins do not have a treaty. And within the basins that do have treaties in place, we've been seeing that the issues that states are cooperating over are becoming more diverse. In the early 1900s, we saw a lot of treaties about navigation, water quantity, and we're now seeing a lot of treaties talking about things like water quality, environmental protection. Things are becoming much more diverse, which you would think would be good for water cooperation. The most common points of cooperation tend to be over things such as joint management, information exchange, technological cooperation, really keeping it at the technical level, as well as water allocation and environmental protection. We see a lot of research emerging that shows that conflict is driven by factors such as limited institutional capacity, large infrastructure and regime type. And we see that cooperation is driven by factors such as similar legal regime, degree of interdependence on shared water resources. For example, countries that are more interdependent on their shared waters may be more incentivized to cooperate over them because that cooperation may benefit both. And the presence of a regional organization such as the EU or SADC. We also see that higher higher precipitation levels reduce the potential for cooperation. Finally, I just want to end with some future directions for where we see trends in water conflict and cooperation going. So Melissa briefly stated that while a lot of the discourse is about cooperation happening over river basins, we are actually seeing an expansion of water diplomacy to include groundwater and transboundary wetlands. And indeed, in recent years, there have been several agreements that have been signed over shared aquifers, which is really exciting. New technologies present new challenges for transboundary water conflict in cooperation, such as new technologies that provide real-time data on precipitation levels or on water availability or on things like the construction of large dams. Inclusive stakeholder participation in water diplomacy is still lacking in many parts of the world, and this is something that still remains a key challenge in transboundary water management. And future research needs to examine how the inclusion of certain provisions in institutions such as treaties can make them more resilient to climate change. And also, how can these institutions respond better to climate change, such as the inclusion of flexible allocation mechanisms or things like this. How can we assess mechanism design with specific outcomes, and how can we determine how effective an institution is? What does effectiveness mean, and how can we measure it? These are things that require more attention. Finally, it's really important to look at transboundary water conflict and cooperation from a multi-scalar perspective. I've been talking about this from the interstate perspective, but water conflict does tend to be more common at the subnational level. And so it's really important to collect data about subnational water conflict and cooperation as well, and how that affects things at the interstate level and vice versa. And of course, looking at climate change implications for conflict and cooperation. And with that, I'd like to hand the floor over to our next lightning talk speaker, Dr. Susanna Schmeier.
Thanks, Alex. I'll follow right on that, and I will zoom in a bit more on the role of institutions. Because as Alex highlighted, we do know quite a bit these days when it comes to conflict and cooperation, and we've seen that cooperation tend to prevail over conflict. There's also been quite a bit of research on what leads from a water challenge, too much, too little, too dirty water, to a certain conflict or cooperation outcome. And there has been a lot of progress in research when it comes to looking at the different intervening factors that potentially shape that link. And there's been quite a lot of research also looking at conflict and cooperation, not as two very different things on a spectrum, two extremes, but things that can actually be interlinked, that can appear at the same time. So this is where we stand. But as Alex was pointing out, there's still a lot that needs to be learned about institutions. And when we look at institutions, we're also moving beyond that sort of dichotomy between conflict and cooperation, because what we're actually looking at in reality is conflict. And luckily, we don't have as much of conflict as media sometimes makes us believe. We're looking at cooperation, but we're actually looking at a lot what happens in the middle, which is the absence of conflict, which is great because we're not facing the costs of conflict, but we're still seeing a lack of cooperation. Cooperation in the sense of countries actually doing something together, developing joint flood forecasting models that the populations could benefit from, developing joint or integrated river basin management plans that would make better use of potentially or increasingly scarce water resources. So when we look at institutions, we're actually looking at two dimensions or two jobs they do. One is preventing, managing, resolving conflict, which is something that quite a bit of research has been done on. In fact, we're, as Casey was alluding to earlier already, publishing a US Institute of Peace paper on the role of institutions in conflict resolution soon. But where there is a little less research on, unfortunately, is the role institutions play in really moving us from just a negative piece, the absence of conflict, towards real cooperation. And if we want to understand the role that institutions play there, we actually have to zoom in. We have to, now I have to see how I made this work here. We do know quite a bit about, as Alex was speaking about, what leads to establishing institutions. And we're increasingly also looking into what makes institutions effective, or do institutions, once they exist, actually lead to a desired outcome? Not only the reduction of a conflict, but potentially also improved well-being of the population or improved environmental protection. But we still have relatively limited knowledge of that black box, or blue box in this case, in the middle. What happens in an institution? How is an institution set up? And a lot of the research that we've been doing in the context of the TFDD is to actually zoom in, look into that black box. Let me go there. So we've been looking at treaties and at the development of treaties over time. And I think this is a quite interesting graph because you can see not only how treaties developed over time, but also how they did in different regions. And you can, I'm not going to go into detail, but you can think how that was shaped by certain geopolitical developments in these regions, by water challenges that these regions were facing, but potentially also the influence of third-party actors at certain times in certain basins or certain regions. What we're unfortunately also seeing is, as Melissa was mentioning briefly earlier, is that there's still a considerable number of basins without treaties. And if you overlay that with the basins that are facing particularly problematic challenges with regards to climate change, water scarcity, and so on, you do unfortunately see an overlap. So there's still, where there are the most pressing challenges, there's still, at least to large shares, a very limited treaty or institutional capacity. We've also looked at the issues that treaties have been covering over time. Alex mentioned it briefly already, how it changed from more single purpose, very human-centric issues that treaties were focusing on to a more holistic basin management environmental approach. And we've, luckily, I would argue, also seen an increasing integration of a larger number of water law principles into these treaties. So also moving from very issue-specific management to actually really defining rights and obligations and ways that countries commit to cooperate over their shared water resources. The TFDD also has quite a big part on basin organizations. For some reason, that nice one after the other clicking in did not work for this slide. But what we're seeing is also that there has been an increase in the establishment of basin organizations over time. Interestingly, though, also a decrease or a slowing down of institutionalization again in the last years, unfortunately. And we're also seeing that basin organizations cover a huge range of issues, usually and hopefully addressing what's at stake in the basin. So we do have quite a good knowledge base about treaties, about basin organizations, about broader cooperation mechanisms, broader, let's say, less formalized institutional bodies. And this can really be the basis for better understanding that black box, that blue box. So really now that we know, at least for now, we'll speak about the future in a second. I'm sorry, I went one too far. For really understanding now what drives the effectiveness, what drives outcomes that come out of institutions. So moving beyond that assumption that we had before, okay, if there's an institution, if there's a treaty, if there's a basin organization, we'll see more cooperation. Everyone's going to be better off. There'll be more cooperation benefits. And this can really help us to dive more into why is that the case, or why also not, acknowledging that there are quite a few treaties out there that we would call zombie treaties, so treaties that have been adopted at some point in time, but now sit on the shelves in some Ministry of Foreign Affairs without actually being implemented, or basin organizations out there that have been established at some point, but are not seeing commitment, support from their member states anymore, and basically end up just sitting there as empty shells. And the interesting thing is that if we better understand these treaty, organization, and bureaucracy dimensions, these are also things that we can shape. Shaping the design of a treaty or shaping the setup of a basin organization secretariat is something, relatively speaking, more easy than changing, for example, the hydrological context in a basin or the geopolitical setting of a basin. So there are things where we can tweak, where we can work on the effectiveness of organizations. And this is particularly important in light of the challenges that we're facing in the future, and where we'll really be faced with the question, how can we make sure that we're avoiding vicious cycles where unsustainable water management leads to less cooperation, leads to deterioration of the water resources, which then again supports competition and conflict, and where we're instead actually supporting circles or virtuous circles or cycles of resilience, where better water management can promote cooperation, and cooperation, the other way around, can also then enhance the ability of ecosystems to provide the services that we need, not only for today, but also for future generations. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the key lessons. I'd rather spend more time on the discussion with all of you later. Just to summarize that from the work that we're seeing in the context of the TFDD, institutions really are, as Aaron Wolf already pointed out early, key for ensuring that challenges in a basin do not lead to conflict. But there's still quite a way to go to understand how and why they actually do this in which contexts, and how we can improve all of those that do not seem to be functioning sufficiently today. And with that, I'm going to hand over to the next speaker, which is Caroline from the Geneva Water Hub. Caroline, please.
Thank you, Susanna. So let me start by saying that decades of experience in water cooperation, decades of experience have taught us that water cooperation alone is not enough. Our true objective is to share water intelligently and fairly to secure peace. For the Geneva Water Hub, this requires two key commitments. First, transboundary water arrangements must be inclusive, equitable, and sustainable. And second, we must protect access to water during armed conflicts, ensuring it is never weaponized. And our practitioners will develop further the first point, and I'd like to delve a bit more on the second point. Having worked in emergency contexts, I've witnessed the severe consequences when water becomes a target affecting civilians. I've seen in Yemen, I've seen in Yemen just how devastating the impact is, especially on children and vulnerable people, as access to water was denied or water was polluted, leading to outbreaks of diseases such as cholera. At a basin scale, conflict coupled with climate change and displacement can also significantly alter the basin scale water balance, with potentially important ramifications for water users in the basin. And for example, displaced people will no longer do agriculture where they come from, but they will impose new demands on water for drinking and agriculture where they resettle. And this can be seen in Jordan, where the influx of refugees has strained freshwater resources, creating tensions between refugees and local communities, but as well between the communities and the authorities. Another example is what happened during the Rwandan genocide in 1994, when the Kagera River was used to dispose of dead bodies, creating a serious downstream health hazard in Uganda. Or more recently with the Nova Kokavka Dam, which will have lasting environmental consequences for the region. In places like Gaza and Iraq, decades of insecurity have put immense pressure on water resources. In Iraq's Mid-Euphrates and southern regions, armed conflicts frequently erupt over water, leading to clashes as communities exploit their strategic location to cut off access to water, or between local governments and communities to ensure quotas of water delivery are respected. These challenges are political, economic, social, and environmental, yet rarely addressed holistically, and especially in a water-scarce, conflict-affected region. You'll tell me that under these conditions, peace seems an impossible goal. But I'll tell you that the reverse is also true. When water is shared equitably and protected from the ravages of war, peace can prevail. Water connects across sectors and is often the last thing warring parties cooperate over. Transboundary water cooperation, which aligns with international law, can serve as a foundation for diplomacy, even in conflict, as was seen with the Senegal River Basin Development Organization in 1989, or as a way to build regional stability post-conflict, as was the case with the International Sava River Basin Commission. To advance the protection of water, I'd like to introduce the Global Alliance to Spare Water from Armed Conflict, which we initiated jointly with the Republic of Slovenia and Switzerland at the UN in New York. The Alliance aims to be inclusive, linking state and non-state actors to build a community dedicated to protecting water from the impacts of armed conflict, to reduce civilian harm, to promote respect for international law, and to build resilience in order not only to prevent, but also to better recover from humanitarian crisis. And we will achieve this through three main activities. First, by producing and disseminating knowledge to deepen our collective understanding of the long-term consequences of armed conflict on water and their broader effects on livelihoods, health, and the environment. And this from a local to a cross-regional perspective, bringing the topic to RBOs and riparian countries to preserve water from pollution and ensuring the basic human rights to water is respected. Second, by promoting partnerships, engaging with key stakeholders and other coalitions to share lessons on effective protection at international, national, and local levels. And finally, the Alliance will advocate to influence policy, building on our knowledge to inform decision-making and policy processes aimed at mitigating civilian harm. We will work to develop the necessary instruments to protect water from the effects of armed conflict. In short, we aim to end the weaponization of water. Although international laws offer some protection, the weaponization of water is one of modern warfare's most disturbing trends. And by harnessing the political will of allied states and the expertise of our institutional partners, we can build the knowledge and capacity needed to make real change happen. The actionable target may eventually take the form of a widespread political declaration, or why not, who knows, a UN resolution. All this is so that fewer children, like the one I saw in Yemen, succumb to waterborne diseases, and so that the shred of humanity that remains during conflict can be used to diplomatically push towards lasting peace. By joining forces, we can make a difference. Thank you, and I'd like to hand back the floor to Melissa to continue the discussion on this very interesting Transboundary Water Cooperation session.
All right, we're going to transition to our panel. So if I could ask our four panelists to join me up on the stage. Next, yeah, not yet. So we'll have a brief panel discussion with pre-decided questions with our panelists, and then we'll be opening the floor to all of you. So you can start thinking about the questions you'd like to ask of our practitioners and our speakers. And those speakers will be joining us for the Q&A portion. All right. So I'd like to start off just getting a little bit more information from all of you about your practical experience and what you consider to be sustainable transboundary water cooperation for the basin or basins that you work in. And I'll let you choose who would like to answer first.
Thanks. So I will present the case of the Sava River Basin because I'm a deputy commissioner in the International Sava River Basin Commission. So just to explain what kickstarted the cooperation, and then I'll switch to what makes it sustainable. There was an incentive and support from the international community, a very important precondition, which coincided with the needs to restore cooperation on water. And the needs of different riparians were actually complementary. They had also all a joint perspective. All riparians were aspiring to EU membership. There was also a pre-existing institutional framework where most riparians were already participating, which is the Danube River Basin. Sava is a sub-basin of the Danube. And well, in the beginning, there was zero trust, and dialogue on political level was impossible. So they moved it to the purely technical level. And technical experts knew each other. They spoke a common language. They had common culture. And this personal trust eventually evolved into the institutional trust, which then helped build the political trust. This was the first form of cooperation that evolved after a 4-year bloody conflict in the Western Balkans. So what makes it sustainable today? There is a robust but flexible agreement based on international water law with a good balance between stability and flexibility. There's a very solid institutional framework with well-designed working methods. There's an efficient secretariat and a well-structured technical level cooperation where national experts are working in different expert working groups, and the Commission trusts their work. So this helped develop a trust in the process. We have good working and personal relations. You know, they are key, but they need constant nourishing. And another important factor, the agreement is quite comprehensive. It integrates all aspects of water resources management and accords to the Commission the broadest scope of responsibilities of all European RBOs. And this, of course, this enables the flexible agreement, and this comprehensive scope enables the basin to tackle also the emerging challenges and the broadening, even further broadening of the scope, which kind of, you know, preempts future tensions, for, you know, reduces the risk of future conflicts. For example, we're adopting now a climate adaptation strategy. We're doing a study on groundwater. We're doing a new hydrological study. We are complementing the very sophisticated flood forecasting early warning system with the early warning system for low flows. So these are basically preemptive actions. Another important issue, political support is there, but no political interference. However, there's a potent risk of a lack of political attention, because this can also be, you know, dangerous. We have sustainable finance, which means yearly contributions by riparians plus project-based finance from FIIs like the World Bank, and other donors such as the EU, plus the technical support by UNEC, WMO, and others. These are essentials. Constant investment in capacity building, and effective and transparent exchange of data, which also requires capacity building. Technological solutions, extremely helpful, remote sensing, satellite data, etc. And last but not least, probably the most important, constant care in the sense of joint ownership, so that all riparians have a sense of joint ownership, joint responsibility. All the riparians need to feel that they are equal partners and they enjoy equal benefits. And I mentioned the early flood forecasting system. This is a good example. It was designed structurally in a way that gives the sense of joint ownership and responsibility for the maintenance of the system. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Tanya. We have one more person respond to this question about the idea of what sustainable cooperation is and what you consider that to mean. We heard a lot of great examples from Tanya from the Sava River Commission. Astrid?
Sure. I think the questions can be answered in all kinds of ways.
It
Anyway,
can.
I'm from the GF. My name is Astrid Hillard. So the Global Environment Facility works with 18 agencies on MEAs, but also on international rivers. My colleague Anders is from the World Bank, so it's all the MDBs, many of the UN organizations, plus WWF, IUCN, and CI, so some of the bigger NGOs, plus some regional institutions. So that makes a lot of ears on the ground and a lot of work and facilitation in the basin. So I think going back to what Tanya was saying, what makes it stable or what doesn't make it stable? So the GF procedures come out of the practice that everybody has seen on the ground. So the need to build trust, the need to build cooperation. You need to get initially people together to get the same vision of where are we going. So this is what we call the transboundary agnostic, or what everybody calls the state of river basins report. A lot of times it's like getting people together, getting people in the bus and out of the bus, making them see each other as colleagues as much as understanding what the other country is about. So I think these institution building mechanisms only as good when they're in the early part as every country understanding the reasonableness of the other country and being able to put each other in the other person's shoes. So you can actually negotiate and understand slowly where the other one is coming from. So the whole trust is a very important thing. capacity, it is not only technical capacity, which is so important. So there's in the end trust to the technical system, so that what comes out of organizations is actually sound. But I think the hump early on a lot of times is also different. If there's different power relations in basins, which a lot of times there is, it is also the capacity to go into negotiations, to know about international water law, to have been in international processes and feeling secure in that. So the experience across the basin is often very different. So the capacity in that needs to be built is a very important part. On institutional part, I think we can also not expect that the transboundary institutions are super robust if not outside also and inside invests into the national institutions. If nationally there is no clear ownership of water or a regulation of groundwater, how can we expect then that the Transboundary Corporation and the institution is perfectly set up to deal with conjunctive water management? So the investment into the national capacities really, really also helps to build a cooperation mechanism. The vision, why to cooperate, building that up and setting priorities, because cooperation is messy, it's expensive, it takes guts, it has political implications for the leaders. So it's very important that you build that vision of why do we cooperate. And what makes it stable is, I think, that where you see the most stable cooperation is the benefits are clear to everybody, including the public. So it is, the electorate carries that along. If you see, the Rhine Corporation, where I come from Germany, people see that their flood is the problem and you need to cooperate to work on that. Or the pollution coming down the river. When I was little, it was very polluted. I wouldn't put my toe in there. Everybody is seeing that this has improved, and therefore government needs to allocate resources, people, and institutions to the whole thing. So I don't want to talk too much, but the flexibility is something that now comes to institutions. It's very hard. Climate change doesn't help. Water scarcity doesn't help institutions because it is so embedded to the survival of the country. And finding leadership to overcome old historical disagreements and mistrust and saying, there's a vision in the future. If we cooperate and integrate and work across sectors, we will be able to be better off if we cooperate. So that visionary leadership is a lot of times it has to push that cooperation ahead. And then it gets to allocating resources and so forth. I will leave it with that because otherwise I talk too long and hand it over to my other colleagues.
I think we're going to switch gears and move to our next question. I'm sure there'll be similar themes that both Astrid and Tanya talked about in your answers as well. But I'd like to shift to the uncertainty piece that we were talking about earlier and moving forward into the future. So what do you see as some of the most impactful factors that can contribute or drive conflict or cooperation, particularly in the context of this uncertain future that we're moving forward? Where do we need to be focusing on, and how might things be changing in that regard? Norris, Anders?
Yeah, thank you. I think that question can best be answered by an example of an institution that has been established by Mozambique and Zimbabwe in 2023. That is the most talked about, the BUPUSA Commission. The BUPUSA Commission is a product of 27 years of negotiations. And what is more interesting about the signing of this agreement or establishment of this institution is that it was witnessed by the two heads of states for Mozambique and Zimbabwe, which shows a high political will and buy-in from the powers be. So BUPUSA stands for, it's an acronym for three watercourses. That is the Pungwe, Buzi, Pungwe, and Save watercourses. So these are the watercourses that are shared exclusively by the two countries. So in order to manage the water resources of these three basins, an arrangement was made that let's have one institution running all the three basins. But how did it start? I would want to go to relate to the presentations that were made by our presenters on conflict and cooperation. It appears that when things are well, it's business as usual, because until 1996, there was no formal cooperation between Mozambique and Zimbabwe in as far as transboundary water resources management is concerned. But a series of droughts in the 1990s that hit Southern Africa culminated in waters of the Pungwe drying up. So this was a natural phenomenon. There's no water in the Pungwe basin. And the Pungwe basin supplies water for two major cities in the two riparians, Mutare in Zimbabwe and Beira City in Mozambique. So the taps dried up. And there was kind of a tense situation because the lower riparian, which is Mozambique, thought the upper riparian was using water for its own benefit, and it was withholding information with regards to the waters of the Pungwe. And this culminated in a meeting. And those who attended the meeting are still here, including the interim executive secretary for Bupusa. It was very charged. The meeting did not yield anything until the parties agreed to go to a field trip to see if really there was water along the Pungwe River, because it was, you have water, and Zimbabwe is saying, we don't have water. So this field trip was done, and indeed, there was no water in the Pungwe River. It was dry. So this marked the genesis of cooperation between Zimbabwe and Mozambique in as far as transboundary water resources is concerned. So here we have a situation where there was a potential conflict which could have precipitated in something bad. And now parties coming together, going to the field, now seeing that there is no water. There were less options, but just to cooperate. So what also then drove this cooperation was the institutional framework that came into place in 2000. You may be aware of the revised SADC protocol and shared water courses. It was put in place in 2000, and the two riparians then took advantage of this robust institutional framework in the SADC region to advance transboundary water cooperation. And they went a step further to establish a joint water commission, a specific commission responsible for transboundary water resources, where they would discuss issues to do with the waters of common interest. But what then drove this process even further was the issue to do with the data. Prior to that, there was no data between the two countries. There was no exchange of data. But after 2000, we see a series of monographs being developed for Pungwe, for Buzi, for Save. And as data was gathered, confidence was built along the way. And this now culminated in these three watercourse agreements that were then put in place. In 2016, we find the Pungwe watercourse agreement in place because there was now data that was there, and the riparians would then make informed decisions based on availability of data. In 2019, we have the Buzi watercourse agreement signed, and in 2023, we have the Save watercourse agreement signed together with the Bupusa establishment agreement. But for sustainability of cooperation with regards to these tri-basins, what made it sustainable was that the riparians agreed to start with easier areas or easier watercourses. Pungwe and Buzi were not very complicated. So they started with Pungwe, right? Confidence building up, they went to Buzi. And the last one was the most complicated, which is Save. Save is complicated up to today because it is heavily developed on the Zimbabwean side, which is the upper riparian, with a total number of dams, 50 dams, and 43 planned measures. So it's a very complicated issue, and they had to pack it until they finish the 2 water courses, then move to the last one. And as we speak today, we have the survey water course agreement, but there is no allocation figures to say Zimbabwe is going to use this one and that one. But in the interest of, because of good neighborliness, they agreed, the parties say, okay, let's have this agreement in place. But in as far as water allocation is concerned, let's wait and carry out comprehensive studies later. And until we do that, let's park the issue of water allocation. So this is one of the issues that drive sustainable cooperation. When you've got issues, you cannot then say we cannot negotiate now because there's this sticking issue. You can pack it and come back to it a bit later. So yeah, just in short, these are some of the factors that drive sustainable cooperation along the Bubusa. Thank you.
Thank you, Norris. Anders?
Okay, thank you. And thanks for inviting me and the World Bank. I think these are powerful examples that actually really speaks much better than theory to what we're talking about here today. But let me just highlight a few things here in terms of factors that could either lead to conflict cooperation. I think we already heard from the earlier presentations here that there's going to be increasing pressure, climate change is bringing that, agreements becoming obsolete, population growth, and so on and so forth. I think if I highlight a few things here, I think it's important, and everyone touched upon this already, the ability of countries and those that support the countries, like the World Bank, like the GEF, but also others, on focusing on real development outcomes, on outcomes that actually matters to countries, and at the end of the day matters to the people that needs to feel it. Because then I think the understanding of the importance of cooperating actually trickles down to where it needs to happen. I think we've sometimes been good at it, sometimes not so good at it. So I think that's a lesson that we can learn, and we need to work more on. So that's one, development outcomes. And I think related to that is also making it more clear what the benefits of cooperation are. I think we in this room, we sort of understand and know that, yes, we need to cooperate because it's good at meta level. But I think if we are to make further strides, better strides, we need to make, and you would expect that from a World Bank person, but we need to make an economic argument that actually resonates with finance ministers, with the prime ministers, not only with the water ministers and those that are more concerned. We've started to do some studies in the Mashrek region, looking at cooperative versus non-cooperative scenarios under a changing climate, and it shows, and you would expect this, but nevertheless, we are not doing enough of it. That cooperative measures and cooperation between the countries will lead to better outcomes for everyone. The challenge may be that these are not necessarily always equal between the countries, but then you need to find ways to. But I mean that would be one thing that we should do more of to avoid entering into too much of conflict and moving towards cooperation. I'll stop there. There's more to say, but I'll restrain myself.
We'll leave some more responses for all of your questions. So I want to have one last question that I'll ask actually all four of you for a brief response to before we hand it over to all of you. But if this was my class, I would be asking you, do you see any differences between your responses to that first question on sustainable cooperation, the speaker and lightning talks, and what our practitioners have talked about here? Because there's a subtle difference in some of the way how things were phrased that really stands out to me. And a lot of that is the idea of trust and relationships in our conversation here that might be a little bit more absent from some of the academic research that was presented earlier. So this is a good kind of identifier of the fact that there often are gaps between what's happening with respect to academic research and what's happening on the ground. So with that, I'd like to ask you all, what's your wish list, if you will, between what should research be focusing on for factors that drive conflict or cooperation? What kind of research would help practice move forward so we can better align to create a sustainable and effective cooperative process in the future? Maybe Tanya, why don't you start and we can go through?
Yeah, well, you mentioned trust. Definitely, I think there needs to be more research on trust building, how to build trust, because this is the biggest obstacle especially in kickstarting any kind of cooperation. And also what Anders mentioned on the effectiveness, on the benefits, the within access, the cost benefits analysis, scenario, modeling, all this. I mean, the politicians, they need to see tangible outcomes, as Anders said. So, and then, yeah, transboundary aquifers and wetlands. With Zoe, I'm very glad that Zoe is dealing with wetlands, because I think that there's a big gap here. Not many people are thinking about transboundary wetlands.
Thank you.
Thank you. Water is and will always be a political issue. So we suggest that our researchers focus more on the role of diplomacy in the management of transboundary water resources, because you cannot divorce politics from transboundary water issues, because even if you have data, but as long as the political arm is not forthcoming, we may be having good data, but of no use. So that is one of the areas that we would want to see researchers focusing on. Then number two, groundwater. It's a forgotten baby for a long time. It's only coming now because of water scarcity, especially in Southern Africa. But really, there isn't much that has been done with regards to groundwater. So it's another area that research has to focus on. And also issues to do with community involvement. We've seen these agreements, and admittedly, we've done them, especially the Pupusa agreements. There is very minimum involvement of communities that are concerned, and research should also be focusing on the communities, because the water affects those communities to which it flows through. So I think those three areas are very critical in research. Thank you.
Thank you. Astrid?
All right, I'm going to thank you for that, by the way. Groundwater and communities, it's certainly true. We see that over and over, both of them not really holding in there because they stay on a high level. I'll come on it from a very, we are funding organizations, we're very global to look around. I think the better tools of tracking the benefits come from cooperation over time. Attribution is not easy, right? So we always get stuck, how can we tell this story better? Because it's not one action and one support and not one thing but still one sees things change over time. And sometimes it's belief, it is because countries trust each other when you look at this 20, 30, 40 years horizons, or also showing what would happen because of inaction. If you that's sometimes easier to paint that picture. So the whole thing of making it clearer, like to the policymakers, what are the benefits or what are the costs if I don't do that, So to really put that in social, economic, and environmental terms would be really helpful. And really also looking at the social impact on the grassroots level, what makes change for people on the ground that are, after all, from in the countries. Another thing that didn't come totally different, coming from a global perspective, not having our eyes always on the ground. I wonder if AI, could help us with, mapping, what'd you say, there's 50 installations on the Pupusa or in the Save, 4D plant measures. Could we have a mapping of something earlier on of where shovels are not put in the ground, but the things are planned? Where things are starting to pop up in discussions. You can pick it up with AI from newspapers and so forth. So there is a way of larger actors, if it's the MDBs, to maybe find smarter solutions to come to the same outcomes that countries want, like some big infrastructure, some canal through a wetland or so. Is there a different way to come to this development outcome and facilitate something that prevents big things to happen? But it has to be really early, right? And before finance is being lined up and all of that. But that, I think, with the new technologies that we could have, would be some tool that could be sometimes really helpful for then others to facilitate a way around it. So benefits and planned measures.
Benefits, plan measures, AI tools. We'll get working on that.
Great. Okay, there's going to be a little bit of repetition here as well. My colleagues have said excellent things, but okay, let me highlight 3 things. Groundwater was one that I already had highlighted. I don't need to describe again, as my colleagues already described, why this is important. Number 2 is this aspect of robust economic modeling, actually showing economy-wide GDP impacts if you cooperate versus if you don't cooperate. I think that's missing. The third one, and that's building on what Zoe and others have been working on, looking at sort of the relation between transboundary waters and public goods, global public goods and regional public goods. We all know that transboundary water cooperation is a regional public good, but what are the links between transboundary water management and good transboundary water management and biodiversity preservation, for example, wetlands, conflict prevention, climate resilience? I think there is a case that can be built out more robustly to show these particular linkages. Again, to highlight why this is important beyond the circle of us that cares in this room. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So we have about 10 minutes that I'd like to open the floor for questions. So if our speakers could come up, we'll bring the other table up. I believe we can take questions from our online audience as well. I forgot to ask that ahead of time. Okay, great. Sounds good. So for those of you online, please type that in the chat and we will correlate your questions and translate them to the room. For those in the room, I will be repeating your questions so those online can hear. With that, I'd gone up there for our panelists. I'll come down here. With that, who would like to answer or ask a first question? Yes, please.
If you have a mic, Catherine.
My name is Open Norma. I'm from the S&P discussion. I hope I can articulate this well. I was really appreciating different items that you shared and thinking about this and the politicization that we see and that's in the practice of work. And I think that both and Mr. Moritz talked about how this cooperation only happens, or it happens when something really visible happens. And you also mentioned about the need to influence the public opinion. So my question is, how do we avoid that water, which is such a beautiful issue, becomes politicized? And what strategies do you have to build critical mass among the general public that this work and these arrangements really are fair and sustainable? So that is this not just the individual benefits, but that there's some kind of insurance, if you say, against politicization. And I don't just mean the community engagement, but also
Thank you. For those on, shall we maybe take two or three questions and then we'll have everyone respond? Okay. Oh yes, I think you had your hand first.
South, counted by this is between 15%. That means you have to apply 100 units wide. Here, A, on average, over the time is approximately five times as much as expensive. Now, we think that we use about 90% while available and accessible fresh water for food production. I can tell you that we only need 20% the water that we're using. If we increase, not only the details of what this means, but we increase our distribution quantity to a minimum of 80%. And that is my statement. That treaties be written that stipulate at least an 80% distribution uniformity for agricultural systems. Using rainwater or irrigation, it doesn't matter. Then the extent to which we have competition for this resource is. We've seen this in action in smaller water basins all over the Western Africa. And we have to bring this, we have an impact, we believe we have to bring this into the simultaneously. It's going to be and I think the technology is there. And finally, what I would suggest is that we look at the costs. Because the cost of doing this kind of work on average is about, again, 20%. But typically, the international development agencies stipulate is the cost of doing this kind of business with the you don't have that never the method of this conflict cooperation,
Thank you. I think I saw your hand next.
Curious about the Zimbabwe experience, other best practice, and how do we, what are the arguments for states to see the benefits of more inclusive policy making activities, how to get municipalities, NGOs into and what would advise for NGOs, local NGOs, like what should we bring to the table to be interesting party for states?
Great. I think we'll go ahead and let our panelists respond to these three questions, and then hopefully we can do one more round. All right, so just for those online, to summarize the question, our first one was talking about politicization. So how do we avoid politicization? What strategies do you have in order to avoid that and to ensure that we have fair and sustainable arrangements? How do we address the elephant in the room, agriculture, with respect to transboundary water cooperation? And then what are some best practices in terms of how we can have inclusive processes, such as using the PABUSA as an example, and advice to NGOs about how they can be included in the process? Would like to start. Maybe Norris, do you want to start with the last question?
Thank you very much. Indeed, non-state actors like NGOs have a role to play in development of any country. But you would see that more at times, especially in the global south, there seem to be friction between government and NGOs. But the PABUSA case is a successful story because here we see a big role that was played by non-state actors. When this journey started, the Swedish International Development Agency funded the development of these monographs. And also coming to these agreements, we have GWP, IUCN, USAID, Resilience Waters coming in. But what made the process possible by and large is that the two parties owned the whole process. The negotiations were between Zimbabwe and Mozambique. The NGOs and development partners would come in with technical support in the background, with financial support in the background. But really, today, the two states stand proud to say, we did it as Zimbabwe and Mozambique, and they are proud of that. There was a pragmatic way of dealing with this issue between the states and the NGOs, and the journey continues unabated. And also, just you may be aware that Zimbabwe acceded to the Global Water Conventions in July. We had a solidarity statement from NGOs to say we commend Zimbabwe for taking this giant step. These are some of the issues that then build relations between government and NGOs. So the two should be seen to be working together. Yes, but I also wanted to respond briefly to the politicization.
Yes, and then Tanya will answer after.
Okay, thank you. I'll give the example of Kariba Dam. In 2022, Zimbabwe had a record wheat bumper harvest of, since it started the wheat production 60 years ago. Then came summer. There was no electricity in Zimbabwe. But Kariba Dam, which provides water for hydropower, had water. And politics chipped in to say, but why are we not getting water to generate electricity for our country? Because now we're in the summer season and we need to grow maize. What made the seemingly tense situation to thaw was the existence of an institutional framework. There is the Zambezi River Authority that is responsible for running the affairs of Kariba Dam. And its chief executive officer, by the way, is Zimbabwe. So what they did was to come and present to Zimbabwe the allocations that were made to Zimbabwe and how they had utilized it, and the allocations for Zambia and how they had utilized it. And it remained that Zimbabwe, you have exhausted your water allocation and you are not going to get extra water, whereas your neighbor is getting electricity full time. So the existence of these institutional institutions help a lot, especially if they are empowered to make these giant and big decisions. Yeah, maybe Justin.
Yeah, Tanya?
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to add to your question. In the Sava River Basin, the way we engaged NGOs is first, some NGOs and professional organizations are observers to the work of the Commission, so they participate in the public part of our sessions. And the second way of engagement is, they are often implementing partners because the Commission itself does not have enough capacity to implement projects, especially EU projects. So we engage with them. So that's one way. And we also have, since 2012, a very vibrant youth parliament that we work with, and we will now also engage them more actively in the work of the Commission itself. You want me to answer? Yeah.
Yeah, if you have a quick.
Sava is not a good example because water, was not a contentious issue when we signed the agreement. So that was the easy thing to do at the time. It's not politicized, but looking into the future, where we're all going to be facing, we're a water-rich region. That helps, but with the climate change prognosis, we may all face agricultural drought. And thank you for mentioning the big elephant in the room, agriculture. It's something, none of us has irrigated much of an irrigated agriculture, but it's something that's in front of us and something we'll all need to be thinking about. And with all these studies and new hydrological study and other measures that we're undertaking now in the Commission, this is to preempt actually this future conflicts. Yeah.
Susanna?
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly add on the politicization question, because I absolutely share your concerns. I think what we're seeing from research, I've briefly shown you some of the figures where you could see the development of treaties and basin organizations. We have more of that from a project that we have at IHE, which focuses on the future of international law. We do see that treaties, basin organizations, general institutionalized cooperation is under pressure through politicization. And I think that's something that's maybe not so specific to water, but kind of something that we're generally seeing in a world that's in a poly crisis. We do see things being politicized, such as water, that for a long time used to be rather technical things, and that comes in the big interplay of nationalism, make my country great again, and similar trends. And I think that's a challenging trend that, especially as researchers, I think we're still struggling with. We're still believing that, oh, if we share more information, and I totally agree with your earlier suggestions, if we just make the benefits of cooperation more obvious, if we can grasp them better, if we can account for them better, if we can communicate them better, I think that's one way to address this, but it's probably not enough. So I think we need to think about how do we go beyond that, and also how do we communicate this beyond the group that we're here? Because if we're honest, the group that we're here doesn't really need convincing.
Well, that last comment from Caroline, and then I apologize, we won't be able to take any more questions because I do want to get your input on the last few Mentimeter questions, and then we'll wrap up the session. So Caroline, please.
Vanessa, I'd just like to come back on the question of agriculture. And just to put back in perspective that water is still a highly fragmented sector. We talk about groundwater, we talk about wetlands, we talk about surface water, we talk about health, we talk about agriculture. But here we have the opportunity with the Water in Peace session in the Stockholm Water Week to elevate the debate and then to really look at water from a more global perspective and integrate this element of peace, which are from the local to the regional perspective, to have like social economic development, and also to have resilience and to have stability. And then I think really the influence to look at the water from sharing and sparing perspective, but including all the various sectors is what we need to focus on.
Thank you all to our wonderful panel and our speakers. For those of you in the room, if you could please open up your Mentimeter again. I'll put the QR code on this screen so you can find that one more time. And I'd like you to reflect on what we've talked about today, what our panelists have presented, what our speakers have talked about, and just think about what's happening in your mind with respect to this idea of sustainable cooperation and what drives conflict and how we're going to address that in the future. So if we could switch over to the Mentimeter, please. We have 3 short questions for you, and then we'll wrap up for, I believe it's a coffee break after this. So our first question. So in your mind, think about your context, your basin. What are the most important factors that shape conflict over shared water resources? So what are the biggest drivers, and particularly if you want to take a forward look, thinking about climate change and all the uncertainty? What are the things we need to be concerned about that might drive conflict? Emotions, money, absolutely. So we're seeing emotions pop up, the trust building, the relationships, kind of the intangible elements, absolutely. We will get a few more in. Community interests, politics, political will, injustice. So thinking about how do we create a more just access, power imbalances. So all really hard and tangible things. If you notice, lack of water's not up there yet, right? So when we think about the discourse and the narratives that you see in the news and the media, question those, because often those aren't necessarily the things that might lead towards conflict. Why don't we move on to the next slide, which is asking you the same question, but with respect to cooperation. What is the most important factors or maybe processes, elements that help to shape cooperation over shared waters? Diplomacy, finance, identifying benefits, having some sort of commitment. So being able to have trust in that process, a vision for benefits. So we have a shared or common interest, common benefits. Benefit sharing is really popping up. Shared data, institutions, community engagement. So we're seeing multi-scalar, we're seeing emotional components, but we're also seeing the legal and the institutional components. How do we build and construct a framework for cooperation? And then trust being a really big one. And let's move to the last question. So what's your wish list? Where do we need innovation, bridging research and policy and science and practice? Where should we be helping to focus and target our research so we don't have these similar gaps in what we're looking at and what we need in order to actually create an effective and sustainable cooperative process so that we can have just and long-term use of our water resources, both for humans and the environment? Politics, so maybe trying to better understand political will, drivers of political will, quantifying benefits and costs, looking at water efficiency, community benefits, looking at diverse values of water. So looking at whose different perspectives might be incorporated into a cooperative process and whose are excluded from that process. Implementation, Indigenous communities, that's something we didn't really have a chance to talk about, but increasingly important, or always has been important, but increasingly being brought forward in the discourse, as it should be. Economic benefits, holistic management, excellent. So if we could switch back over to the PowerPoint slides, I'll have just a couple concluding remarks. Maybe. There we go. So ultimately what we've seen, there's a lot of novel research. Our understanding of transboundary water conflict and cooperation has grown substantially over the last several decades. And we're seeing a lot of new emerging and innovative practices with respect to transboundary water cooperation. But we don't always see this alignment between research and policy. So we need to start thinking about that integration. So the next steps, if you're interested, we'll be continuing to look at this gap. And we'll try and collate all of your responses as well as the input from our speakers and panelists into maybe a policy brief or joint publication. So you're welcome to reach out to me if you're interested in participating in that in the future. And then I'd also like to conclude with just inviting you all to the launch of the new Transboundary Freshwater Diplomacy Database. This will be on the 27th at 4 p.m. at the Dutch booth. We'll be having drinks and some networking event for an hour. And you can see the launch of the new database with some of the data that Alex mentioned and Susanna mentioned as well. So please feel free to join us. We're happy to answer any questions during the break. And I hope you have a wonderful week.